So we are in Genesis chapter 1. We went through kind of a long introduction uh, about why, in particular, Genesis 1 and creation has such an important role right now, and how it's been discussed in so many different ways, and how there's different views on it, and such as that. And then we got into the passages themselves, and we got through day 1, where God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and him separating the light from the darkness, and light he called day, and the darkness he called night. And then, so that leaves us on day 2 in verse 6. So this is all new stuff starting now. So it says, "And God said, Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day." All right, so here on day 2, we have God creating what we would consider the heavens, and we have him creating the waters below. And this separation aspect happens over and over again, and then he kind of names it. And because of this, throughout all 6 days of creation, where he does some sort of separation, some sort of what we would consider taking the chaos, bringing order into it, and then naming it. That's going to set us up for when humanity shows up, because what does he ask the mankind to do? What does he ask Adam to do? He's supposed to take the animals and separate them to their kinds, right? And say, this is who you are, and this is who you are. He's not creating the kinds. God creates, but he's separating them and naming them and kind of partaking in creation in that way to an extent. And so, in this one in particular, there's a lot of talk about this, because there's debate on what it means when there's a separation from the waters below, from the waters above. If you go to the flood account, it talks about the gates of heavens opening and water pouring out onto the earth. And that has given some speculation that this aspect might be even a little bit different than what we're used to now. They believe there may have been some sort of heavy atmospheric water above the earth. And the reason why that's argued is there's been lots of even scientific back and forth between how oxygen rich we need things for an animal such as a dinosaur to survive and live. They say if you were to put a dinosaur here today, there's not really enough oxygen to keep the thing alive, so it must have had something different back then. They also, some people argue, this expanse was very different, and that's why you read through the genealogies at the beginning. If those years are literal years, people living to be in the 900s, they blame it on a different atmosphere that didn't decay us so quickly. That's one of the arguments, at least, and one of the theories. And on top of that, we know that before the flood, that there's a heavy mist sometimes, and even sometimes argued water that comes from under the ground that comes up in waters. But some people, not everybody, but some people argue maybe this atmospheric pressure had something to do with keeping the plants alive in a different way during that time period. So lots of back and forth with this one. And again, as far as you can get is there's some interesting theories, and you can make speculation, but you really don't know. What we do know is he separated the waters from above and the waters from below. And in the symmetry of Genesis, the first 6 days, this would be matching day 5, where he puts the fish in the animals in the sea and then the birds in the sky. And so I think we're safe on saying that this is at least, if it's not more than this, it's at least the creation of the seas like we have them and the sky. And because of that separation between this, we finally have an atmosphere on the earth. It's not just some sort of, just this water mass like we saw at the beginning when he made light and darkness and when the Spirit was hovering over the waters, right? Well, this is different than that aspect because now we have the sky and we have the separation, and that's why it's included into its own day, on day 2. So, again, day 2, we got the seas, we got the waters below, and we've got the sky. Now, according to this, the waters were covering the whole surface of the earth. There was no land yet. And that's why we get to day 3, we have something different happen. So, starting verse 9, it said, Then God said, Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. So, what does he do? He separates again. He separates the waters away from each other, and then what appears? We get land for the first time. And so we have dry land and we have sea. So we have that separation again. And then what does he do after that separation? He calls it the dry land, earth, and then he calls the waters the seas. And so for the first time we get a name on what the waters below are, the seas, and then the dry land we call earth. All right. And then the last part of verse 10, and God saw that it was good. That's not the end though, because then God said, Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning the third day. So after he made the dry land, he has vegetation appear on it. And there's different Hebrew words used in the midst of this. And it has this idea of the vegetation that makes the grass, like the field, wheat, those kinds of things. And then also the vegetation being the trees that produce fruit after their own kind. Some people say it's interesting that the word for trees here is different than the one used in Genesis chapter 2. I don't make too much of that, but some people do point that out, so I just want to say that, to be fair, that maybe the Genesis 2 trees are a little different, and vegetation in Genesis 2 that's being created is something new compared to this. But again, really hard, because we're doing a whole lot of speculation just based on using 2 different words that could mean a similar thing. So, let's kind of recap. We have God separating light from darkness, creating light, day 1. We have God separating skies from the waters below, right? The expanse above, the waters above, and the waters below, separation. What does he call that? The heavens and, right? He actually calls it the waters below. And then in day 3 is when he takes those waters below and he separates them out, and then they get the name seas, which we're used to. Like Mediterranean Sea, etc., etc., except for most of the time we call it ocean today, don't we, guys? And then on that dry land, he formed vegetation. He's setting everything up. He's got all the background ready now after those 3 days for what comes next. And so he's going to start filling these things up. This is just the background again. And he's going to start filling this stuff up with what we consider a little bit of a hierarchy of creation. We got light and darkness, day 1. Well, verse 14, we're going to see the light and darkness be filled, and the reason and what this part of it does anyways, when he creates what we call celestial bodies. So verse 14, Then God said, Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a 4th day. So now he takes the division of light and darkness is all we have before this. Well, he takes the light and he makes the sources of the light. And the sources of the light are in the greater light that governs the day. What's that called? And the lesser light to govern the night. It's called the moon. Okay. And then he also made the stars. And what's interesting in this aspect, there is a little bit of a theory that this comes from an extremely old text. And the reason why they believe this might come from an extremely old text is because it does not call it the normal sun and moon. It calls it the lesser light and the greater light. And they say it might even have come from some sort of source that came before they had a word for sun and the moon. They called it the lesser light and the greater light. And so that's really interesting that they believe this tradition. So there's, let me kind of back up. I'm getting too far ahead of myself. When Moses wrote down the book of Genesis, or at least compiled this aspect of it, some people strongly hold that this was oral tradition that had been passed down for many years before Moses. There is a group that says this is all new stuff that God just showed Moses because Moses had this special relationship with God, which was true. Okay, this is the man that was closest to God pretty much from anybody since Enoch. Okay, it seems like. And so here with Moses, it could have been direct revelation, but it seems, just because of how it's written and such, that this might be based on much, much, much older tradition that's just been passed down for years and years and years on how God created, which is very interesting. Again, I think has some sort of weight in it, being that we went from Adam to Noah to the next big ones, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the next big figure ultimately being Moses. So it seems like it may have been something that was passed down from very, 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 very early. And so I wouldn't die on a martyr's hill for that argument, but I do find it at least interesting. So with that being, let's talk about what he created these what we can consider the celestial bodies, what he created these for. He said, number one, we have is for light. We have the sun and the moon, both give light to the earth. And also the stars and such. It's more than just that. It's also for seasons, because they went by when to plant, when to do all sorts of different things based upon when they saw the star formations, which was extremely important in an agricultural culture. You went by the stars. They didn't have a calendar like we have today or anything like that. Secondly, it also went for certain special days, and it even goes to the point also so we know the difference in day and night. Okay. I will bring this up one more time. One of the strong arguments for the people who do not hold that these are 24-hour literal days, when it was evening and it was morning the first day, is because it's not till this day here that we have the sun and the moon to give us days. So it's kind of hard to understand, well, what were the three before that if we don't have the sun and moon giving us a 24-hour period yet? And so again, there's speculation there, and that's a biblical argument for why these might not be 24-hour days being talked about in Genesis here. Okay, now let's go to verse 20. So day 2, go back there, we have the waters below and the waters above. Consider the water below and then the sky, the heavens, right? Well, here we get that filled. And in verse 20 it says, "And God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day." All right. So we have swarms of different types of animals that come. And when you think of swarms of different types of animals in the sea, what do you think of? You think of different types of fish. Now, what's interesting about this, in the most ancient cultures we have, when they're talking about sea monsters, they're literally talking about sea monsters. These big kind of animals that can take your ship down. And because based on that, you go furthest back, there's a lot of theologians that think, well, these sea monsters, they would include what we would see like whales and killer whales, but they would also most likely, at least in these arguments, include the animals that are now extinct, um, like the dinosaurs. And if you read about the Leviathan in Job, it most definitely sounds like a dinosaur that lives in the sea. It's kind of hard to get away from that if you ever read that. So go to Job chapter 40 and read from there. You don't have to do it right now. We don't have time. But if you go to Job chapter 40 and read from chapter 40 through chapter 42, it's talking about everything that God created and how big God is because of Him being such a great creator. He talks about the Leviathan and the Behemoth. And if you read about the Leviathan in particular, it had scales like armor, and honestly, if you read it, it sounds like a dinosaur dragon type thing almost, that lived in the sea. And again, great speculation, and many really smart people, theologians, believe this might have been talking about what we would see as the extinct dinosaurs that lived in the sea. So it's just interesting to point that out, and it does fit very well with these sea beasts that lived in the ocean, that he put in the ocean at this time. Okay, now that wasn't the only thing he did, because he made the sea beasts, and he also made the animals that flew in the sky. He filled the sky up with different types of birds. And then he said, and let the birds multiply on the earth. All right, and then there was evening, there was morning, the fifth day. All right, and then we get to verse 24. And we continue to kind of grow and grow and grow, getting a hierarchy of creation until we get to this last day, day 6. And so he's filled up where the light goes. He's filled up the seas, the oceans, right? He's filled up the sky. Well, now he's going to fill up the dry land. Okay. And in this it says, then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. So I'm going to stop there. We're not done with day 6 yet. Got one more really important creation here on day 6. But let's talk about these animals. And the Hebrew is a little bit interesting when you get to this, because when it talks about the cattle that are created, they use that word quite often, talk about like the tamed animals. So for ones like, well, you consider like the sheep or oxen or horses or goats or those kinds of animals that are more tamed and used by humans. That word was used. What's very interesting, the thing kind of surprised me is when I did a little study on it, and that which creeps on the ground after its kind. So what comes to mind when you think of something that creeps on the ground? Yeah, you're thinking about lizards, like serpents, like bugs, those kinds. That's what comes to my mind. Creepy, crawly things. Think of that. But in the Hebrew, and it's used in other places, it's like anything that scurries. So anything that's like fast on the ground, uses its legs real fast. That would include mice. That would include lizards. That would include like even probably groundhogs and things like that. Anything that scurries away. Rabbits would be included in this as well. So it's weird because when you hear the thing that creep on the ground, you don't think of a rabbit. But anything that's really fast and kind of scurries by real quick. And then the beasts are the larger animals. The beasts of the field. And it wouldn't consider like the cattle and things, but this would be like elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, lions, those kinds of things. And even it would be, what would they consider the behemoth, which had a tail like a cedar tree. Okay, so if you looked at a behemoth and it had a tail that large, and again, take this from Job, you see this aspect of these huge animals. Pretty strong speculation, pretty strong theories that we're talking about dinosaurs even here, and that the people knew about it, or Moses was given information about it, but that would fit within this category of these huge land beasts. Everything kind of from what we would consider a lion up kind of thing. So if it's not tamed by man, it fits into this group of beasts. If it's small and runs real fast, even from bugs to rabbits, it's this idea of creepy, crawly things when I think of it, but it's things that creep. You can think of the word scurry, it might fit a little better in our definition. And then, of course, cattle is anything that's really with humans and tamed by humans. Just want to point that out. Now, lastly, we save for verse 26. It says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." So here is the pinnacle of creation. Out of everything we have, from there being light, okay, to the oceans, to the sky, to the stars, to the moon, to the sun, to birds, fish, and even all the land animals. And then you jump, and then God said, let us make man in our image. The first time he said this. It is interesting, and a lot of people point out that notice it's plural words that are used. First off, then God said, Elohim is used for God, which is a plural word, usually meaning the idea of majesties and such. But then there's a plurality where it says, let us, plural, make man in our, plural, image. And gives kind of the first sign that there's more to God than this aspect of just one person. Because we got an us and an our here. And so, with that aspect, man being made in God's image, in particular here, we need to talk about what does that mean and how does that separate us from the rest of the animal kingdom. Now, what has God been doing in this chapter? Yeah. He's been preparing, he's been forming, he's been making, he's been getting ready, he's got all this stuff going on with man. It's interesting, how many days did he take to do that? 6 days, right? Okay, how long is the work week in the book of Genesis? 6 days. So just like God was ordering, now there's a difference. God created out of nothing, ultimately. He created out of nothing. But when man creates, he's doing more of that aspect when God was separating and naming, correct? Taking dominion. And so when man takes dominion over the matter and over time and over the space that we have, okay, we are, like God, involved in creating or bringing order. And so if you can think of yourself in that way, even when you go to work, what you're doing is you're bringing order out of chaos. You're keeping things going, and this is something that was there before the fall, that we were supposed to be involved in this aspect. And so a large part of us being made in God's image is our continuance in creating, our creativity and making something new, that kind of aspect. So that's a large part of it, but it's more than that because we name. We'll get that in Genesis chapter 2. Adam was to name, just like God named the different things that he was doing after he brought order to it. And he also had responsibility over it in a large part. So man has responsibility over creation. And what's another part that I want to point out is when God created man in his own image, he created them in his image. So that means male and female are both created in God's image. there's not this idea, and some people kind of pull this, or at least act this way. Well, then we have God, okay, and man is created in God's image, and then woman is a little lesser than man created in his image. No, this is a very true statement, equality statement, interestingly, that both male and female were created in God's image and have that respect and have that aspect. And throughout the rest of Genesis and into the Old Testament, into the New Testament, that's why humans are seen with such value. It's because God made us in his image. Okay? And so, interestingly said, and you can argue this, that all the fruit trees and the plants that were given to us for food that yield after their own seed were given to man and to animals at this time. We don't have this aspect of meat until after the flood. So I do want to point that out as well, that we don't really have God saying, okay, you can go and eat meat as well, and kind of like a stamp on it. There might have been that afterwards, but we don't have a stamp of approval on that until after the flood. It does seem like this is very much a vegetarian type like creation that God had made, which is a throw out to all the vegans and vegetarians out there. Now, am I reading into that a little bit more than I should be? I don't know. It seems pretty clear, but some people would argue with me. And I have heard somebody, I can't remember who it was, but argued, well, I bet you that fruit tree tastes like fried chicken because I can't see paradise without that. I don't remember who said that. Somebody at church. Was it Aunt Toy? Yeah, I remember that always stuck with me. That's the aspect of creation. And a few points before we move on to the last day, seventh day. So we have 6 days of work here. Every time God created something, number one, the plants were after their seed to reproduce like they were. The fish and the birds were to produce after their seed or after their kind. And also the animals were to produce after their kind or after their seed. That's what made them what they were. Okay, and why I point that out is that's a very strong argument against what a lot of people argue in evolution. Because evolution would argue over time species have changed. You see. And the further you go up, like, okay, well, now this seed is producing some other type of seed, some other type of animal. That's just not what we see in Genesis 1. And so if you do hold to the theory of evolution, you have to come to terms with Genesis chapter 1 really pushes against that idea of having different species come out of another, if that makes sense. And so that's one thing that I see. Secondly, we have a strong push towards the Trinity in Genesis chapter 1 because of the us and the our in verses 26. Okay? So let us make man in our image. And we see this similar thing in Genesis chapter 11 when the Lord Yahweh went down and was called us as well, had the same plural. So not only Elohim, but Yahweh is seen as a plural in Genesis chapter 11, which really focuses on this interesting thing throughout the Old Testament of some sort of plurality in God, which we don't get a fuller picture until the New Testament, where we have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which lots of times people argue is a Trinity. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, I want you to see the hierarchy of creation and that there's a different value system. Okay, because of Genesis chapter 1. Our worldview holds that humans are seen with more value than the animal kingdom. And that surprises people. They are to be the ones that are over in dominion over the animal kingdom and takes care and rules over the animal kingdom. Okay, and it pushes against this idea of, heard a story once of a man who was in India who was fixing a piano, and I heard this on the radio. I think it was like 90.1. But he was fixing like pianos. That's what he did for a living. He went to this really rich man's house. He got in there. they said every time we push these notes, nothing's coming out. And they're like, what's going on? And so he gets in there and he opens up the piano and all these cockroaches just start swarming everywhere. And so this American piano tuner and fixer is over there and sitting there smashing them, and the owner's having a fit. He's like, no, stop. And he got all the servants together and they started trying to catch all these cockroaches and let them out very carefully outside to keep them alive, because in that view, with the idea of reincarnation, he believed this could be somebody he knows from way back in the day or something. And so we have to save the cockroaches, because they actually put cockroaches and all sorts of different animals on this a similar level as humans, because all we are life forms that are going up or down this chain of, even in that view, there's kind of a hierarchy, because if you had a bad life, you might go down a few steps in animals. But if you had a good life, you might go up. And then if you become a human, you have a good life, you might go up in society. It's kind of the view of, at least part of the view in reincarnation. Scripture does not allow that. Even here in Genesis chapter 1, we don't see that and don't have that understanding. We don't see the things in equality. So I hope that kind of helps overall. We do see poetry in the midst of this. We see a strong aspect of God doing something and then filling that in later on, and it parallels, and it's a purposeful parallel. You can see that very, very clearly. Some argue, well, this is just proving that this is not how God did it, but it's just a poetical way of showing creation. Well, my argument to that is, well, God seems to be very poetic himself, the creator of poetry, so doesn't it make sense that he poetically created? That makes more sense to me, ultimately. So, all that said, we've got all the way through the hierarchy of creation to male and female, and then we move to chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. This will be the last thing we read tonight. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Right. Now, why this is interesting is 7 is not a normal aspect. In the stars, in the sky, how the sun rotates, in the hours we have, in months, in anything. 7 is not a normal way to count things, nor does it naturally fit. But humanity, for all time, has been having this aspect of a 7-day week. And the 7-day week only really has a source that we can find in this idea of creation, that God created in 6 days, so on the 7th, he rested. Well, that means man works for 6 days, and on the 7th, what should the man do? Should rest. And this becomes a hold for what we consider the Sabbath rest from here on. And as we get further into the Old Testament, you see that there's even laws based on this. That because God created in 6 days, and on the 7th he rested, well, man, you're going to work for 6 days, but on the 7th, this will be your Sabbath, or your holy rest. Sanctified rest, separated rest. Well, you will take a day off, and it was meant to be no work and only for worshiping God. And the best way I can kind of explain it is kind of like dealing with the strong spiritual aspect that this is like date day with God. This is the day that's separated for him, where we don't do other things, but we worship him, think on him, talk on him, etc. That's why many churches for a long time had Sunday morning and Sunday night services, because they believed you should have a cap at the beginning where you're worshiping God, and have this aspect throughout the afternoon where you're resting, right? Lots of times, if you read the old school days, a lot of people will be sometimes praying or have Bible reading days, even those kinds of things, worship days, and then it would end on this, everybody come back together and worship God on the end of the Sabbath day. And so it kind of bookends it. And that's kind of why there's Sunday morning and Sunday night churches, and where a lot of that tradition came from. It's because the Sabbath was for rest. Different cultures kind of see the Sabbath in different ways, ultimately. Like if we were here 80 years ago, what's one thing you could not do anywhere around the area on Sunday? Right? You couldn't go shopping. You couldn't go. The restaurants were closed. Everybody was Chick-fil-A back then, huh? Really, and so everybody was closed on Sunday. And what later happened is, okay, when things started to open, then there was one thing that they said, well, you can't do. We'll keep liquor closed on Sunday. And so you couldn't drink liquor or buy liquor on Sunday. And that's one of the things that kind of held on for a long time in this culture. Now that's out the window. People get further and further away from that understanding. I have people that come to our church sometimes that's still like, I don't know, it's Sunday and I really don't like going shopping on Sunday, because that was the culture and they held this as a separate day kind of aspect. And I don't think that's bad. I don't know if I'd be legalistic on it, but I don't think that's a bad aspect to say, well, this day is really separate unto God. And so just interesting there. So he rested. And again, was this a one-day rest and then the next day he started doing something else? Some people argue that. He got back to doing stuff. But there's also a pretty strong argument that right now we are in the day of rest. And that this is the, how do I put it? This is the rest that God is not creating, and this rest will last until new creation, when Christ comes back and we all get our glorified, redeemed bodies. So there's that theory and argument as well that I think I should throw out there because it's fairly popular, that we are in the day of rest right now. When you get into the New Testament, the book of Hebrews points this out, and what the book of Hebrews does is it takes everything in the Old Testament and shows you how Jesus fulfilled it. And they actually fulfill the Sabbath day within Jesus, because it's argued in the book of Hebrews that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. That He's the one that did the work. He's the one that brought salvation. Now that we can rest in Christ. And so some see us here in the New Covenant as in this rest in Christ, and that He fulfilled the Sabbath. And it's such a strong hold that Jesus, when He came, when He lived, when He died, He resurrected on Sunday. And because He resurrected on Sunday and they saw God doing some interesting new work, many Jewish Christians that were raised up understanding that on Saturday was when you rested. Well, many changed and said, well, because Christ resurrected on Sunday, now the day of rest is Sunday, not Saturday, because of new creation and what Christ did. And to honor Him, the day of rest became on Sunday. So that's why Jewish synagogues are open on Saturday, and most churches meet on Sundays. And it became known as the Lord's Day, which is said even in the book of Revelation, when John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And so that's why it's changed from Saturday, the last day, to the first day in the New Covenant, when we sanctify that day as our day of rest. So, hope that was a lot, I know. We went through a lot. But I'm hoping we kind of grasped that aspect and just saw throughout just what the language itself is telling us about creation. Interpretation goes a little bit one way or the other depending on what view you hold on how to interpret these. If you're a long day, if you believe this is the perspective theory, if you believe this is a 24-hour literal period, it will kind of go back and forth. So it depends. If you listen to a preacher, this chapter will be taught a little bit differently depending on which view that preacher holds. I tried to do, these are all the different views that the church kind of holds as a whole. I believe, even though I think they're important, I do believe ultimately it's a secondary argument. And what I mean by a secondary argument is we can still fellowship with one another even if we don't hold the same view of Genesis chapter 1. But it is important, and I think understanding all the views and where they come from so we can scripturally look at them and see if they line up is important. It's very important. But that's all I have for tonight. And we will start in talking about, in particular, the more detailed creation of Adam and Eve, starting in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, I believe, next week. So next Sunday night. So with that, we'll dismiss in prayer.